Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into one of the oldest and most profound arguments in human history, the logical case for a creator.
So why is there something instead of nothing? It's a question that's kept people up at night for centuries. We're going to explore an argument that claims to have an answer, and we're basing our breakdown on a detailed presentation by the Christian Apologetics channel, O Apologeta.
Now, just a quick heads up. Our goal here is not to prove or disprove anything. We're not taking a side. We are simply here to understand the logic of the argument, to see how it's built, piece by piece. Think of us as architects just mapping out the blueprint. So, let's get into it.
All right, Section 1, Logic Beyond Science. Right off the bat, this argument sets its own ground rules. It starts by drawing a really clear line in the sand between two very different ways of thinking about the world. So on one side, you have science, the stuff we can see, touch, and measure. It's fantastic for understanding the physical world. But the argument here is that science has its limits. Like, you can't put love in a test tube or calculate the beauty of a sunset with an equation, right?
And that's where this other idea, metaphysics, comes into play. It's all about tackling those bigger, non-physical questions using pure logic and reason. What does it even mean to exist? This distinction is super important because it's the foundation for everything that follows. Okay, Section 2, an argument for a cause. Now that we have that framework, the source starts to build its case. And it does this using a classic tool from logic called a syllogism. It's basically like a logical recipe. If your starting points are solid, the conclusion has to be solid too.
And here it is. This is the roadmap for the entire argument. You've got three main premises, statements we're asked to accept as true for now. The whole idea is, if you can prove that premise 1, 2, and 3 are all solid, then that conclusion at the end isn't just a suggestion, it's a logical certainty. So first things first, we got to tackle that first premise. Everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. That is a huge claim, right? So how on earth does the argument try to back that up? Well, it uses a classic thought experiment. Imagine you're walking through the woods, and boom, you find a watch, just sitting on the ground. What's your first thought? You're not going to think it just popped into existence, right? Of course not. You'd know someone, a watchmaker, made it. The argument is, if that's true for a watch, why wouldn't it be true for something infinitely more complex, like the entire universe? To dig a little deeper, the argument splits everything that exists into two buckets. In one bucket, you have contingent things. That's pretty much everything we see around us. People, planets, puppies, their existence depends on something else. They could have not existed. In the other bucket, you have necessary things. These are things that have to exist by their very nature. Think about numbers or the truth that 2 + 2 = 4. They don't depend on anything to be true.
So the big question is, which bucket does the universe belong in? The argument here is that it's clearly contingent. Why? Well, because everything inside it is born and then dies. We can imagine a totally different universe. This means the universe itself depends on something else for its existence. It needs a cause, and that cause can't also be contingent. It has to come from that other bucket, the necessary one.
But wait, you might say, couldn't it just be causes all the way down? Turtles on top of turtles forever? The argument says, no, that's illogical. Think of it like a line of dominoes. For the last domino to fall, the first one had to be pushed. You can't have an infinite chain of falling dominoes with no one starting it. There has to be a first, uncaused cause.
Okay, Section 3, Evidence for a Beginning. So this idea of a first cause only really works if the universe actually had a beginning. If it's been around forever, that whole domino thing gets weird. So the next step is to show the universe isn't eternal. And for this, the source pulls from both philosophy and modern science. First, the philosophical angle. It's a bit of a mind bender. Imagine the past as an infinite series of events, like an infinitely long hallway. To get to today, you'd have to cross that entire infinite hallway. But you can't cross an infinite distance. It's impossible. So if the past were truly infinite, we never would have actually arrived at today. The very fact that we are here, now, means the past must be finite. Then the argument shifts gears and looks at the science, and it claims that multiple lines of evidence all point to the same conclusion. You've got the Big Bang model. Rewind the tape on our expanding universe, and you get back to a single starting point. Then there's the second law of thermodynamics. The universe is like a wind-up toy that's slowly running down. If it had been running forever, it would have run out of energy by now. The fact that it hasn't suggests it was wound up at some point.
All right, Section 4, defining the Creator. Let's recap. The argument is tried to establish that the universe had a beginning, and that beginning must have had a first, uncaused cause. So, the million-dollar question is, what or who is this cause? This is where we circle back to premise 2. And the argument here is actually pretty clever. It says, look, if we've established the cause has to be outside of space, time, and matter, in other words, something supernatural, then what would you call that? The source suggests that even a skeptic would have to agree that the definition of such a thing is what we call God.
And from there, it's a process of deduction, like a detective building a profile. If this cause created the material universe, it must itself be immaterial. If it created time, it must exist outside of time. It has to be timeless. To create the whole universe from nothing, well, that would make it all-powerful. And maybe most importantly, the leap from nothing to something required a choice, a decision. And only a personal being with a will can make a choice like that. So you take that list of attributes, timeless, immaterial, all-powerful, supremely intelligent, and personal. And what do you have? The argument concludes that this isn't just some abstract force. This is a perfect description of what philosophers and theologians for centuries have called God. Now, the presenter knows what some people might be thinking. Aha, this is just a God of the gaps argument. Using God to fill in whatever science can't explain yet. But the source is very clear on this point. It argues this isn't a conclusion from ignorance. It claims this is a conclusion based purely on deduction and logic, an inference to the best explanation. Okay, but even if you follow the logic this far, it leads to another massive question. We've talked about a timeless, powerful, personal creator. But which one? Which God are we talking about here? And this is where the argument makes its final, bold leap. It moves out of abstract philosophy and zooms right into a specific point in human history. The source identifies this creator, this first cause, with a single person, Jesus of Nazareth. And with that, it leaves us with an answer that isn't just philosophical, but profoundly historical and personal, presented as the ultimate resolution to that very first question: why is there something instead of nothing?